check the action again, make sure there's nothing has moved or got pinched. That's very good. So now we just have to reassemble all the various levers in the shutter and clean them as we go, since some components looked a bit oily. Okay. This little component here, I'll zoom you in a bit. This little component, that's a little hook which holds the main ring, or the main lever as they call it, firmly in the cocked position until you press the shutter release. It's a little catch. So I'm just removing any surface contaminants here. This is all old grease. I'm looking for see if there's any corrosion problem with this. And I'll check its action just to make sure that it moves freely. And it does. That can go into position in the shutter. Find its screw. That goes here. Yes, that's good. Now there was a T and little levers that looked after the T and B settings, which was that one, that screw which belongs with that component, and that screw belongs there, I believe. Check and make sure I've got nothing left that I haven't got a home for. I have one component with no one to speak for it. It's this little thing here. Now I suspect that has nothing to do with anything here. Before I started taking the shutter apart, I had a big tin of washers and spaces out that I was finding something from, and I suspect that that's what that one came from. It wasn't what I thought at all. Right, let's clean these components. I'm just giving them a wipe with the solvent on a cotton bud, and I'm interested in here in removing any old grease, thick dirt, old oil, anything of that nature, anything that would prevent these components from being able to swing freely under the power of their return springs. That looks good. So we'll start with that little lever there, and that's the first one to go in. Let's back this out a bit. Other way, it's better. This lever fits in the case there. Its screw has a small shoulder on it to locate that. Act as a pivot for that lever. There were a lot of changes during manufacture of these shutters. It would have been as the manufacturer tested new ideas, either to improve the product for the end user or as a potential way of saving money in the manufacturing process. And some ideas, some changes you would see made and they would disappear. Later production they reverted to doing things the way they'd been done earlier. This little brass collar here, the screw runs through the centre of that so that the brass collar is a step in it. That acts as a pivot for this lever. That's it, how that screw started. It helps if you're a little bit ambidextrous for doing tasks like this. I'm sometimes using the screwdriver with my left hand. That spring hooks up onto the end of that lever we put in first. I'm making sure that that springs back freely, and that this lever, which holds the blades in the fully open position, also springs back freely. That looks good. I'm just going to put a tiny smear of molybdenum paste on the surfaces of that catch, so that as that comes forward into the fully open position on the B or the T setting, it would be caught and stay there. That looks good. I'll check those 3 screws. They're good. Check that one again while I'm here for good measure. Our shutter release lever. Sometimes you'll find these are damaged because perhaps someone had been extra heavy-handed when using the camera, or they have tried to force the lever when it very clearly didn't want to go, which in most cases will be because it wasn't intended to go and people were just ignoring the signal. That's the T setting working there. There's often a bit of friction to the way this works, which of course makes no difference for the B and T settings. This is the important part. That is free and snappy. That's what's wanted. Now the return spring for the shutter release button is provided by this component. And this component, when we put that in, we also put in the high-speed spring. The spring that provides the extra tension That provides the very fastest shutter speed on these shutters, which is a 500th of a second, I believe, yes. And it's a spring that only is brought into action solely for the 500th of a second, and it otherwise takes no part in the action of the shutter. That spring fits over that shaft there. This lever forms part of the cable release mechanism if the cable release socket on the shutter was in use. It also gives you your return spring for the shutter release button. It feels good. This component would be where you could put a cable release. It's been blocked off with a screw. That would have been intentional. That's by design. On this camera, you could use a cable release there on this camera. There's certainly no option on the body to otherwise fit a cable release. If a cable release was fitted here, it would bear on the end of this arm, which would have exactly the same effect as pressing the shutter release button. So let's pull that down out of the way, tighten that screw up. On the earliest Retinas, the 4 previous Retina ones, there was a plunger, like the end of a shutter, like the end of a cable release, screwed into this this socket at that position, and you would have released the shutter at that point because they didn't have a shutter release on the top of the body. That feels good. Now I've got my mechanism plate, no, not my mechanism plate, my main lever, and this is covered in grease, dirty old dried out grease, and this would have been original. It does require some lubrication, and I'll be doing that with my molybdenum. It didn't require anywhere near as much grease as is quite commonly found on some of these, and that's just down to drift in behaviour, you could say. But when the assembly line is set up, and whoever designed the shutters was responsible for making sure that they were being manufactured in the correct fashion, inevitably they would have told people to put a little daub of grease here and a little smear of grease there. But it's like Chinese whispers. By the time it's been done 1,000 times and the instructions have been passed from one person to another, the delicate nature of the disposition of the lubricant as it was intended tends to be lost, and the people fall into the trap of if a little bit's good, a lot must be better, and so you end up with equipment smothered in grease. This would be by no means be a bad example. The worst shutters for oil and grease contaminations are ones where somebody has opened them up and got in with their little can of 3-in-1 and given it a squirt And you do see those from time to time. I'm just trying to get my spring correctly hooked over. Why is that blade open? There. Okay. Alright, that's together. I want to clean this. This is the shutter speed cam, so called because the lever on the retard gear train, on the arm and the retard gear train, which determines how much engagement with the retard gear train is involved, runs on these surfaces, these cams here. So they should be clean, free from cotton lint, like that cotton bud there. There's some sort of deposit. Well, the camera just stopped then. I think we just got to the file size limit. Just checking the action of this again. Oh. I'm just watching this because it's displaying some of the faults it showed earlier. And I'm trying to pick what component is causing that. Something's catching or rubbing somewhere. I'll have to investigate that. Well, I'm very happy with the action of the shutter now. I did find something that was amiss. The retaining plate for the blade actuating ring had 3 screws in it, 2 short ones and a long one, and I had swapped 2 of them over. So a screw was protruding through the mechanism plate in such a place that it caught one of the levers as it passed by. Not every time, but there was enough friction there to cause a problem. So I'd been a bit remiss there. I was quite confident I knew which of those 3 positions had the long screw, and I didn't bother to check that I'd actually done it correctly. So that was the answer. But the shutter is otherwise running very smoothly now, and I will put the cover plate on the front, and when I've finished with the camera body, the shutter can join it, and that camera will be ready to go back to the other side of the world, where no doubt it is destined to be used. Of course, I've probably moved everything since I took it apart and can't find my screwdriver. There we go. And I should have 1 small screw left, and I do. Fortunately, that's all I've got. It's nothing worse than coming to the end of a strip down and service job and finding something on the bench, some stray part. Very good. So that's all ready to go home.